Good evening. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to the first episode of Truth to Power for 2021. My name is Faraz Patel. We hope you had a good holiday season and it's good to be back. And again, it's another year of anticipation, excitement, and of course, how will we as humans survive what is the current pandemic of COVID-19. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Well, our discussion is not going to be about COVID-19 or what is happening with South African politics. We are going to the United States of America. As we speak, Joe Biden has been inaugurated as the 46th president of the United States of America. And of course, his vice president, history in the making, Kamala Harris, will serve as his deputy. So the question is, what happens now under the reign of Joe Biden? We saw with his predecessor, Donald Trump, he only survived one term. So the question is, how will Joe Biden go ahead and deal with the challenges? There's COVID-19, there's the vaccine rollout, there's of course the debate of Black Lives Matter, and of course white supremacy that continues to rear its ugly head in the United States of America. Well, my guest today is somebody who is well equipped and well versed with regards to politics within the United States of America. I am joined from New York City by Sean Jacobs. He is an associate professor of international affairs at the New School. Sean, thank you so much for joining us here on Truth to Power.
Thanks for having me.
Now, it's an absolute pleasure. Sean, before we talk about the inauguration that has happened, let's cast our minds to 2 weeks ago. Now, a lot of people thought this was a couple of Hollywood directors and execs getting together for a takeover of Capitol Hill. This was no movie. This happened in real life. How did Donald Trump manage to incite this sort of hostile takeover of Capitol Hill amongst his supporters?
I mean, I think you have to understand that he was something different in American politics. He wasn't a conventional politician, and over a period of time, what he managed to do from his office as the president, he managed to let people have less trust in the institutions of government. That is specifically the state. Like that, there's a state. The state is the one that delivers like policing, i.e., safety and security. It delivers healthcare. It takes care of the schools. It does criminal justice. None of those things, I think, were happening effectively under Donald Trump. And then he made mostly white Americans question the efficacy or the legitimacy of those institutions. Secondly, I think he also made sure that people lose their trust in those institutions that are next to the state that people normally go to for information, for trying to find out what is going on in politics. That is the media in the US. He basically created this impression that the media was fake, that his supporters shouldn't trust the media, and that from the outset the media was out to get him. And then secondly, he also made a number of populations that often had nothing to do with what the cause was of people's calamities, i.e. the massive unemployment, the fact that there were all these social and economic crises around the US. He made sure that people blamed those groups of people. And there in the US, there are sets of people that are always vulnerable to be blamed. One is immigrants, especially immigrants from south of the US border, i.e. from like Mexico, Central America in particular. They are right-wing American politics, because politicians, remember Donald Trump's a Republican, they have a good way of demonizing that population. And then I think Black people. So, Black people have a historical claim about injustice in this country around racism, but there's a way in which that claim, which is a legitimate claim, can be presented as a threat to white people. So, they're coming for your house, they're coming for your job. When, as I said, it's often the neglect of the state or the sort of rapacious, like they expect, how capital just wants to make more money out of you. Like that might be the reason why you're poor, but you can blame Black people quickly. And then I think finally, his demagoguery. I mean, this is unusual. I mean, in US politics, there's a history of demagoguery at like various times. You had, I would say, Joseph McCarthy in the 1950s. This was like the anti-communism of Joseph McCarthy. So this was a US senator who held public hearings in which he outed supposed communists and had them lose their jobs. Some people went to jail. And then, you had kind of the politics of the early 1980s with Ronald Reagan, who was kind of a secular president, but with him came the demonization of people who were, poor, mostly poor and black, like women. They refer to people on welfare as welfare queens. So, but this was like unprecedented. The guy had his own, like, if you want, bully pulpit. He was on Twitter all the time. No American president until Donald Trump had used social media to communicate directly to his supporters like he did. Barack Obama had a Twitter account. He had millions of followers. And in fact, when he came to power, he was historic by the amount of followers he had on Twitter. But he only occasionally tweeted. When he tweeted, he signed it with, in parentheses as BO. That was like maybe once a month. Donald Trump was doing this 20, 30 times a day. His whole aim was to bypass the media. But I think in the process, and this is sort of my final point, he created like these loyalists, these people who would take him at his word, who would disregard those institutions of society, even when all the evidence presented itself. And in this case, there was an election. There are issues with American elections in the way that it tries to disenfranchise like poor people, particularly black people, working class people, try to prevent them from voting, like creating all kinds of obstacles in the way you need to register, extra registration, like you need 3 forms of ID or whatever, like taking them off the voters roll. But I think in this case, what happened was he made people question the legitimacy of the election, and he made those people who disagreed with him, he made his followers think those people were traitors. And then he also, it seems now that they were also from within the police service that had been implicated in these deaths and attacks on ordinary, just regular black people going about their business. Some of those people also turned up at these protests, and some of them allowed these protesters to attack the US Congress. So, I mean, that's how we got to that, what in the end looked really pathetic, right? They went into the chamber, they grabbed some stuff, they stole documents, but in the end they got pushed out. And so what he did was how did we get there? What I think what he showed in the end was just how fragile American democracy has always been. Like they've been very good at papering over and creating the impression through the movies to making us think that it's the greatest country in the world, et cetera, et cetera. But in that moment, we could see like at the base of the society what's brewing there, all this like reactionary anger of white Americans, and that also within the chamber, despite all the evidence, despite that possible coup or insurrection, after that you had Congress people still defending the people outside, including Donald Trump, still defending those people.
Sean, we always talk about what would be the legacies of each and every United States president that has served in the White House. When one speaks of Donald Trump, I know there will be obviously the negative assertions that will be given to him. And of course, this is of his own making. But when the question does come, what is the legacy of Donald Trump? What would be some of the points that you would look at to say, I mean, was this president really the sort of man the United States needed?
I mean, so just on a personal level, I can tell you that I am very relieved to see Donald Trump go. So I've lived in the U.S. I first came to the U.S. in the mid-1990s as a student, which was during the end of the first term of Bill Clinton. I then stayed through the impeachment. I was here during his impeachment. I went back to South Africa, and I ended up back in the U.S. when George W. Bush came to power. So lived through the 8 years of Bush. I was here for the two terms of Obama, and for Trump's very short-lived 4-year term. So I think I can speak with some experience, about what is it like to live through those presidencies and then think about their legacies. And as I said, I think from a personal perspective, it is. I can't tell you how many people are just sort of relieved. And of course, South Africans can read this on Twitter. People watching the show, they can read this on Twitter. But people are so relieved to see him go, because what it was for 4 years is this kind of idea that you would just wake up in the morning and you wouldn't know what's going to happen today. What crazy thing, what offensive thing is Donald Trump going to say today? So at the basic, just at a basic level, before one thinks of, talks about sort of more substantive political things, I think just at the level of kind of the symbolism, the imagery of the presidency, I think the legacy is that like it will be the end of just a group of like white men, visibly offensive, white men governing and being offensive at the same time. Like, waking up every day, creating obstacles for regular people, particularly, as I said, people of color, Black people, poor people, immigrants, to just exist. I think like at a very basic level, that's it. But if I had to pick like a couple of things, I think like the first one is for me, just the utter neglect and failure of government. And I think it was shown most explicitly with COVID. You mentioned this at the start of the program, as living through this pandemic. I think the last year was, I mean, the major legacy now of Donald Trump is that 400,000 Americans died under his watch. I think it's now more than 2 million people are infected with COVID. And there was no leadership from the White House. I mean, he openly would contradict. If you want, they don't have a minister of health, but like the advisor, they have cabinet secretaries and so on. But the person he had put there, Dr. Fauci, Anthony Fauci, who had worked with Reagan, worked with Clinton, worked with Obama, and he made this guy, he acted like he understood medical science, that he understood public health, and he wasn't trusting, coming up with all kinds of, I mean, it was ridiculous to think that he talked about injecting people with a bleach, with cleaning supplies. So, the COVID thing, I think, is his first major legacy. I think secondly, racism. And again, you could argue that under President Obama, that's when Black Lives Matter started. That's when the attacks on Black men, as I said, for just existing, standing outside a store and selling loose cigarettes. That's Eric Garner here in Staten Island, which is about sort of 40 minutes away from where I live. Or, be a little boy in a park playing with a toy gun. A lot of that started under Barack Obama. So it wasn't like that the police suddenly became racist or violent towards Black people under Donald Trump. Obama, I think, at least tried to address it, even though it was clumsy. And I think there is a question that Obama was struggling with, trying to be, given the sort of expectations on him, be an American president rather than be, as the media would have it, a Black president. So I think he tried to be fair about it, and I think as a result he failed. But it seems like with Donald Trump, there was none of that. There was none of that. This was just he was siding with the police. He was siding with if you want, whether you want to say systematically with the police or rogue police, like there's certain bad apples. But he would praise them. He would defend them. He would also, during very racist violence by white supremacists in Virginia and other places in the U.S., he would refer to them as there's good people on both sides. So just, you can't say enough about just the sort of like everyday brute racism under Donald Trump. The fact that he then aided and abetted and empowered like these people who thought it was okay to be racist. So that's another legacy of Donald Trump. Finally, I mean, we could mention many other things, but I think two others is the major crisis of our time is the climate. The fact that the world is getting warmer, that, the world that, I don't know if you have children, but the world that my children, who are now teenagers, that they are going to inherit is it's of global warming, it's of rising sea levels, it's of drought, of just hot summers, humid hot summers. I mean, it's like floods. So the question is like, Donald Trump just seems oblivious about this. He wants to continue with mining, et cetera, and so on.
Sean,
Finally, this foreign policy.
Sean, unfortunately, I'm going to have to stop you there for us to go to an ad break. I know you wanted to go ahead and elaborate on some of his legacies, but when we do return, we are going to be focusing on the future and, of course, the challenges and what to expect under President Biden. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Truth to Power right here on ITV Networks. We are discussing the inauguration that has just happened of President Joe Biden. I'm joined by Sean Jacobs from New York City, the Associate Professor for International Affairs at the New School. Sean, the challenges for President Biden. Now, of course, we have an American nation that, of course, seems divided through politics and, of course, so many social aspects. He comes in. What would you highlight as some of the priorities that he needs to sort out to get that sense of unity back within America and, of course, just achieve some of those short-term targets?
So just before we went to the break, I think you were trying to shut me up. And the reason for that, as you can imagine, is this is the problem of unburdening yourself after such a crazy period, that when you say, like, what are the legacies of Donald Trump, it is impossible to, like, summarize and say, like, oh, he has like 4 or 5 big things, because as your viewers will, if they recall, it was just a crazy time. So it's impossible to kind of like just go, oh, I'm going to say these 5 things and shut up, because you can do that with any other sort of regular politician. But in this case, this just seemed it just seemed extraordinary for an American president. So in terms of Joe Biden's challenges, I think the things I mentioned, I mean, in terms of like what was the stuff that Donald Trump did badly, and I'll do it quickly. I think, of course, dealing with this COVID crisis, I think, how do we get past this pandemic for the American economy, for people, keeping people safe, which means providing people with vaccines, and convincing nearly half of the population who supported Donald Trump that it is in their interest, like it makes sense for them to wear masks, to abide by protocols, and to get a vaccine. So that's a key challenge for Joe Biden going ahead. He has announced already I think it's a $1.5 trillion stimulus package. That's just like his economic plan, and a big part of it is around COVID. I think secondly, he has to get the confidence, I would argue, of Black people. I think a lot of the arguments were like, Donald, oh, we must heal the country now. This is very much a sort of Republican tactic, which is after they've done like all kinds of horrible things, they turn around and say, we must have unity now. Mitch McConnell, Lindsey Graham, these are the sort of the senior politicians in the Republican Party, senators, they serve in the Senate. So they have this tactic of saying, we can't have anything divisive now. You can't go after Donald Trump. You have to show some, show reconciliation. The problem with that is, I mean, that would just, I think that because Donald Trump has created so much damage to the political system, to the legitimacy of that system, and to American political culture, I think it would be a mistake not to take him on. And it is true the Senate is going to have a hearing about his impeachment. And then just quickly, I think, as I said, it is a question of Joe Biden has to do a lot of work to convince Black people that this kind of impunity that the police have won't go ahead. One thing at a very symbolic level, he has a vice president who's Kamala Harris, who's African American. So that shows people confidence. He's appointed a number of people to his cabinet. He seems more in tune with some of the issues that Black people are concerned about. And I think 2 other things quickly: the climate change, and I won't say more about that. But I think beyond that, there's definitely, he has to deal with the American economy. The Americans have has a habit, like a sort of a tendency of papering over the crisis in their society by sort of trying to be feel good, and selling people sentiment. But if you in the US, you notice, like in a place like New York, in Manhattan, which is the business side of New York City, you will be surprised and shocked by just the number of office blocks or commercial real estate that is standing empty. So there's clearly an economic crisis. So one quick thing on that, he has announced that they're going to give people these cash grants. I think it's the amount they came up with is $1,400, about, I suppose, like about 15,000 Rand. But the demand by people were like something like $2,000, which was $600 more. And so they only came up with this 1,600. But I would say those are his major challenges. Yeah.
Sean, the vaccine rollout. Now, obviously here in South Africa, we are still awaiting what the plan is with regards to government for the time and the duration of the rollout. With the United States, of course, being a first world country, there was a concern from the World Health Organization that rich countries should not hoard the COVID-19 vaccines. So as Joe Biden is seen as the man who could sort of resurrect America or take America from the dark place that Donald Trump was. And we know that Donald Trump, of course, had sort of cut funding towards the World Health Organization. What is his role now to make sure that there is equality of vaccine distribution, not just amongst the Americas or Europe, but especially the poorer continents like South America and right here in Africa?
So I think the big thing there is I don't expect much from the US, and I think it's regardless of whether, I'm talking globally, when you say like, let's have a more equitable system for how accessible vaccines would be to people living in countries like South Africa, India, or Brazil. I don't think anybody expect much from the US. The US has always acted selfishly in international relations, whether it's when it defies the UN and goes in to invade a country, under false pretenses, it will do that. I think it operates in the same way as we were sort of saying about the climate. It is like, is it good for American industrialists? Like that's how they think. And you could argue the same thing with vaccines at a global level. Everybody is supposedly part of this. There's an alliance, I think it's called the Gavi alliance, which is the vaccine. It's an alliance of countries around vaccines between the private sector and the public sector to develop vaccines and then to make those vaccines equally available. As we are learning, rich countries, as you say, they're hoarding vaccines. So in some cases, I think I read in Canada, for example, can vaccine its people 3 times over. So the problem for the US for the last 4 years is that because Trump was so bad at governing, there was very little coordination and in America, there's also a kind of very complicated system between the federal government, which is like in South Africa, it's the central state, Pretoria, and the states, which are like the provinces, and like in South Africa, it's much more simpler. You have 9 provinces, 8 are ANC, and I think one is the Democratic Alliance, which is the Western Cape. In the US, it's a lot more, there's a lot more splits, it's more even. And those states which are not Democrat are the ones run by the Republicans. They're more rogue. They're governed by people who don't believe in science, who don't even believe that people should be vaccinated, who believes in sometimes things like herd immunity or, this is, the whole thing is a hoax. So I'm not, the way that I'm sort of dancing around it, but what I'm trying to say is I don't have much hope for the US to do right by this. Now, I will say this, though. It is true that Joe Biden, because he comes from sort of more, even before he was vice president under President Obama, he has a habit of working together, being sort of collaborating. And he has a history of being less in international forums. When he was vice president, he often disagreed with Obama. I think he disagreed with Obama about the invasion of Libya, for example. So he's broken at times with the consensus of American foreign policy within the bounds of it, not radical, but within the bounds of it. So you might see something interesting from him. One of the first executive orders that he's signing, since he's now in office, is around the Paris Accord, right? Around climate change. So I think we might see something different from a Biden administration. I haven't seen yet who is appointed for that particular post to negotiate at the WTO or in the alliance or with COVAX, which is something that the alliance created, that the Vaccine Alliance created. So it will be interesting to see going ahead. The problem in the US, like I said, American politics is very domestic. They don't really care that much for the world. I mean, for example, if you think of like how Trump treated Africa, it wasn't like there were people disagreeing with him about his Africa policy because they hardly care. Americans mostly care about themselves.
And that's the unfortunate part of it, because we'd like to see unity and, of course, equality that occurs within the globe that we live in. Well, after the break, we'll be continuing the challenges and, of course, what to expect from the newly elected US President, Joe Biden. Welcome back to Truth to Power here on ITV Networks. I'm in conversation with Sean Jacobs. Sean, when we talk about female politicians and, of course, the whole gender relations scenario, there's always a sense that females always get pushed to the side. Now, Hillary Clinton came close in 2016, of course, to becoming the first ever US president, which was going to be a female. When Kamala Harris enters the frame, she's not just a female, but she's a female person of color. Explain from that perspective, especially for the vast ethnicity that the United States has, of how big an impact this is of Kamala Harris being the vice president.
So American, I mean, probably the easiest way to answer is to say American political culture is historically very white.
Yes.
It's very hard for a person of color, a black person, and in Kamala Harris's case, it's somebody who's also of Indian descent, or even it's even harder if you're Latino. You know, if you're Mexican, South American, or Spanish speaking to be public representative at the highest office in the U.S. Political system. So you could, if you look at the American Senate where she served, right? She's the only black woman. There's now the governor of California, he has to appoint a senator to sit in her seat until the next election. And he appointed a Latino, a man, a Spanish-speaking, brown American. And so now there's no black woman in the Senate. And then if you think about it, the senator-elect from Georgia, whose name now escapes me, there were two senators. One is John Ossoff, a white senator, and the second one is a reverend who got elected. That is the first, I mean, it's embarrassment that I don't even remember his name, but he's the first black senator from man or woman from the American South. This is like saying he'll be the first black, representative of the LPOP.
And we know the deep divisions in the South.
Yes. Yeah, from like Santon or the northern suburbs.
Yes.
You have a black person who's elected for, the sort of those kind of very rich white parts of northern Joburg. I mean, that's the history of that's been achieved here. So this is very significant in the US politics. And America, America loves symbolism. It tells a story about itself, that it is always moving forward, and that all those things that are in the way, whether it's Jim Crow, which was like apartheid, Jim Crow was the system in America, which was similar to apartheid, whether it was the racism of the 1960s, whether it was about how they treated women, how they treated gay people, etc. It's never, those are not things that are like problems with the American system. It is, we're always moving forward. And so it shows like how great a country we are. And I think Kamala Harris, Americans will celebrate this. You can expect, all kinds of laudatory write-ups about it. They'll make a lot about your origin story, like so they tell like how far you've come, where you're coming from, how you're going. Barack Obama was a classic story. Before that, it would be a white working class man who makes it. So Bill Clinton's from like rural Arkansas, single mom. Barack Obama then kind of ups it. He's mixed race, single mom. It's like fathers from Africa. So they love that kind of story. And I think similar with Kamala Harris, who is actually has a really interesting biography, which is one, she has this father from Jamaica who's a very well-known Marxist economist. And then she has a mother who is a scientist who was an immigrant from India. They meet. So just that kind of like in the 1960s, when I suppose it wasn't, even among, I would say, Black and Indian people at that time, I don't think their parents were like, oh, we're having a mixed marriage in the household. So there's so many layers to her story that makes it really interesting. I think she's one of the first Black women to be a senator from California. As I said, the first Black woman to be a senator, and then the first Black woman to be a senator from California. That is amazing. So those things are going to be played up. And I think Americans, rightly so, they should be proud of themselves. But one of the problems I often have with Americans is like in the way they tell those stories, they act like it's never happened anywhere else. So for example, the Black senator who's, as I said, I'm embarrassed to say, I don't know his name. He was right in saying he's the grandson of a slave and that he was now in the US Senate. But then you could argue that you can make some of those same arguments in South Africa that are even way more, was even way more revolutionary. That you had like, I know he's not held in such high esteem in South Africa now, but you had somebody like Jacob Zuma. His mother was a domestic worker. I think he only became literate in his teens, and he learned much. He had much of his schooling on Robben Island. I mean, that's even way more radical in the kind of changes that people have made within a society. And most of the generation of politicians of color, black politicians in South Africa that came after '94 could all tell those kind of stories. But America has a habit of acting like they the first with something. They've only elected a woman as a vice president, yet there are countries in Africa that have elected women as president. So just on I think there is an American tendency to like play that stuff up. You could say, yes, it's a very powerful country. It's rather difficult to make it to the top. So when that person makes it to the top, it is quite an achievement. And just quickly on that, at the same time, as I said, there's been women who've been at the top, and it doesn't necessarily mean that if you elect a woman, if you elect a black person, and preferably, yes, it's great that you elect those people, but then the question becomes, what would they stand for? And for me, I think the real test of somebody like Kamala Harris is like, how is she going to govern? Again, the vice president doesn't have as much power as the president has. Maybe on some policies they take the lead, but it will be interesting to see whether she does right by those communities that are investing so much in her symbolically, like black people, women. Whether if they can see a return on that during this presidency, then for me that would show the success of we've achieved a little bit more here.
Well, the power of Google has just allowed me, Sean, to just type in the Reverend. It is Reverend Raphael Warnock. Yeah, that is the
yes,
that's
Warnock,
the man.
Reverend Warnock.
Reverend Raphael Warnock. Before we go to the break, Sean, the quick question I want to ask, and as you say, the challenges. It's nice to have again a female of color, but of course we have those deep divisions within the United States. You mentioned the South, the white supremacist groups, the neo-Nazis, the Ku Klux, even if they are secretly organizing themselves, they are still there. We still have African Americans, Latinos, and many other people of color fighting for franchisement within the United States system. How does President Biden find a way to make sure that the white supremacy groups do not rear its ugly head, and making sure that franchisement to people of color occurs?
I think the classic thing is like how, if you're to put it in South African terms, you want to see him act almost like Mandela. And again, I'm saying this with all the caveats about the limitations of the Mandela model. But I think what you want somebody who sort of acts, who stands above the politics. And in the American system, the president is a little bit like that, and it is really the White House. So in other words, like the cabinet secretaries, the Council of Economic Advisors, like those people are responsible for like they write the policy, and the president is more like the face of it. And then I think Obama was probably, he tried, I think of all the US presidents, he probably like presented something like that. Bill Clinton was maybe a little bit more successful. So after Donald Trump, anything that is not as divisive as Donald Trump, and I think just from like the early signs, what Biden is doing is to, when there was the attack on the Capitol, where Congress is, where the House of Representatives and the Senate is, I mean, Biden made it very clear that these people, they are racist. I think for me, that would be the, for his presidency, I think to succeed in that way, he has to be very frank about the fact that is outside what is considered as normal or legitimate in American politics. But he, at the same time, he cannot create the scenario which Donald Trump did, which is to create the impression that the demands of right-wingers are the same as the legitimate demands of Black people, women, Latinos, etc., gay people. So like that's going to be for me the challenge of Joe Biden. Like I said, as I said at the beginning, at least early signs for me is he's appointing the right kind of people to be responsible for the environment, in the housing secretary, etc. So he's making sure that he's doing some of this. But again, it's too early for me, I don't think you can judge. After about 100 days, I would say it would be opportune to say, okay, Joe Biden is doing okay in getting us to the goal of not necessarily uniting the American polity, because I don't think people fighting for social justice would necessarily want to be united with racists, with white supremacists, but at least in creating a consensus in America around a project that is not like the project that Trump represented.
Coming up after the break, we all know America loves to get involved in the rest of the world's politics. So the question is, how will Joe Biden go ahead and work out his foreign policy? We'll wrap up the conversation after this break. Welcome back to Truth to Power. I'm in conversation with Sean Jacobs. Sean, before obviously the elections that happened last year, we saw President Donald Trump along with Israel going ahead and normalizing the ties. Now, three nations have of course done that: Sudan, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates. Now, is that a model that Joe Biden is going to go ahead and follow? And the reason why I'm asking is because everyone in the world knows the contention between Israel and Palestine and what is currently happening within that part of the Middle East. So how do you see Joe Biden's sort of approach, especially with regards to the Middle East?
I think, again, U.S. foreign policy doesn't change much between presidents. Republicans they have a reputation of not getting involved in foreign policy, except that that's not true. In practice, that's the way they sell themselves. They're like, oh, we're non-interventionists. We don't get involved in ideological politics in other parts of the world, things that doesn't involve us. We only do it if it's good for American business. But as it turns out, whether it was Ronald Reagan, but particularly I would say George W. Bush, that they have certain ideological politics, right? The neoconservatives under George W. Bush. But I don't think there's any marked change within among American elites when it particularly comes to like wider Middle Eastern policy. If you just take that as a region, and specifically say the occupation, the Israeli occupation, I don't think that there's a lot of there's much difference between the two parties. There was I think in the electoral campaign on the Democratic side, which is Joe Biden, which we can assume that's the more progressive side of American politics. Only one of the candidates, I think, condemned the occupation of Palestinian land, which is Bernie Sanders. Most other Democratic candidates, they would just continue the general American policy of supporting Israel. And as and on the Republican side, as you saw, Donald Trump was sort of very all out. He was taking the Israeli position. And then secondly, he sided with, if you want, the despots of the Middle East, the Saudis, of the various kind of regimes in the region that don't allow for any forms of democratic government, basically characterized by all kinds of repression. So I would say I don't expect much from Joe Biden when it comes to that kind of policy. They might try to rein in the Israelis like Obama did. For me, it'd be interesting to see who's going to run what they call the Foreign Affairs, the House Foreign Affairs Committee and the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee. That's the most powerful politicians. Whoever heads up those committees, and the Democrats, they're in charge of both houses. So their people are going to run those committees. I think that would be interesting to watch. I think it's less for me what Joe Biden is going to do, and I think it's more interesting to see what the more progressive group of public representatives in the House and in the Senate are going to do. And I think I want to single out, because I think they're very interesting, Rashida Tlaib, whose family is from Palestine, Ilhan Omar, who originally comes from Somalia, Alexander Ocasio-Cortez, who's a Puerto Rican background from New York City, Jamal Bowman, who's a Black American guy he represents people just above New York City in the House of Representatives. So I'd be curious to see how they are going to operate. They haven't been afraid to call out the hypocrisy of the United States in its support of regimes in that region, in its failure to do anything about what Israel is doing. So for me, I think that's going to be the interesting. But again, like I said, I don't have much hope for much change in American policy. Even if you sometimes you speak to Israeli activists, they would say the key things when it comes to US policy is for the US to stop supporting Israel at the level it's supporting Israel in terms of like military aid, technical aid. And if it withdraws that, like that's a major part of what keeps Israel to continue to govern in the way that it does. I think similarly, you could say in other parts, that the so-called normalization in the Middle East, this is basically Israel and a series of governments that are all undemocratic and face resistance or opposition from within its own population. So there's a lot of play that happened here, and it'll be interesting to see how and where this would go as we go ahead. I mean, for Africa, for me, as I said earlier, Donald Trump, he referred to African countries as shitholes. I don't know. Sorry, apologies if you want to take that out. But he was quite rude about Africa. He was more interested in like saying sort of anecdotally, my friend is making money. I think the only two African presidents that he invited to the White House, one was Sisi from Egypt. I mean, Egypt going from a dictatorship, having a democracy for like a year, and then Sisi's now in power. And I think Denis Sassou Nguesso who's been a long time president, I think since the 90s of Congo Brazzaville, rigging elections, etc. So those are the people that Donald Trump has invited to the White House. Museveni, who just basically rigged an election in Uganda. So what's interesting about the Democrats is that the Democrats are not, I would say, rhetorically or openly showing their support for dictatorships, but what they will do is that what works for America. So they'll have practical arrangements with dictatorships, but in public, they'll talk this kind of democracy talk. And I don't know if you've noticed, Biden has announced Samantha Power as one of the senior officials on foreign policy. And if if people have forgotten who she was, she worked for Obama also. I think she was national security advisor, or she was in charge of the Secretary of State, which is like the foreign minister. And you can imagine her talk was kind of regime change, that America must intervene to save people, etc. So you could see some of that coming back here.
One final question, Sean. We know right here in South Africa, President Cyril Ramaphosa is seen as a pragmatist. You mentioned Donald Trump's views with regards to Africa and how he refused to speak to the entire continent. What does President Cyril Ramaphosa need to do along with Joe Biden to reaffirm the US-South African sort of relations that was enjoyed during the time of the late President Nelson Mandela, then of course his successor, President Thabo Mbeki, with the likes of George Bush and Bill Clinton?
So the thing about, one is like Ramaphosa, I think, now serves as the chairperson of the AU.
AU, yes.
Which is a sort of nominal position. I think it's everybody takes a turn, but I think it's very useful and strategic that he is the chairperson now, and maybe from that position, I think he could definitely try to speak as if you want, like the de facto leader representing African interests. I also think we underestimated, and those South Africans, we act often like nobody else counts in Africa, but it is also true that it is the strongest economy on the African continent, and probably it has its most robust sort of democratic culture. And so from that position, everybody knows that within the American hierarchy, the South African ambassador is usually somebody important. So the last sort of significant ambassador was Patrick Gaspard, who later became the chairperson of the Open Society Foundation. The current ambassador, I think it's a sort of, I don't think it says any
Lana Marx.
Any background in diplomacy, and it was a businesswoman.
Mrs. Lana Marx,
of Trump to appoint business people, people who've supported these campaigns, etc. So it'll be interesting to see if she stays on or if that changes. But just going back to President Ramaphosa, I think South Africa still has a role to play. At the same time, it's unfortunate, like a lot of damage, I think, was done starting with Mbeki. And Mbeki, by the way, was seen as he was sort of a favorite of George W. Bush, Clinton. Clinton, etc., liked him and so on. But he did a lot of damage to South Africa's reputation, particularly with his AIDS policy. I think you could say he did some damage with the Zimbabwe policy, but that fitted a little bit in how the Americans handle those kind of crises. And I think so. South Africa had a certain place, like it had a certain leadership position, mostly because of Nelson Mandela. But I think, and I'm saying that was very short because remember, South Africa was not like that before Nelson Mandela. But starting with Nelson Mandela, it developed a really good reputation. It was very short-lived, and it would be interesting to see Ramaphosa getting that back. And I'm saying this with relation to like things like the UN, the WTO. At the UN, that South Africa shows again that kind of moral leadership, that it stands for rights and doesn't kind of back down at the last minute. I think one place where I think something interesting is happening around COVID at the WTO, there was a proposal to change some of the ways that the vaccines are distributed to come up with a more equitable system. And that proposal was actually made by a South African official who's from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and India kind of backed up the South African proposal, and they took that proposal to the WTO, and then other countries signed up with it. So if South Africa does that kind of leadership and leverage that with the Biden administration, which I think they'll get a better hearing than they would have gotten under Donald Trump, then yes, I could see a role for President Ramaphosa.
Well, we'll wait to see what happens. Of course, the first term of President Joe Biden has officially begun today. Sean Jacobs, thank you so much for making the time for us. Hopefully, we'll be able to speak soon as we continue to monitor the progress and the presidency of Joe Biden. Thank you so much.
Baie dankie dat jy vir my beliggeer het. Ja.
No, it was an absolute plezier for you to hear. Well, there we go. That is Sean Jacobs. He is the Associate Professor for International Affairs at the New School. Well, the question is, what now happens with President Joe Biden? The presidency of Donald Trump presented us with so many negative moments. The Black Lives Matter, his oppression of black people, his support for Israel's occupation of Palestine, and of course, just going ahead and denting the rights of so many women within the United States and across the world. So we are going to hope that Joe Biden, as United States, is seen as this Western superpower, and of course, on the face of it, the beacon of democracy. So it remains to be seen what happens. Well, my name is Faraz Patel. This has been the first episode of Truth to Power for the year 2021. I will see you again, same time, same place. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.